I've had the opportunity to speak with the Australian Prime Minister, who I had dinner with, and I think he was feeling very pretty chuffed that they had gotten Facebook and Google over a long period of time to this point where they were finally striking commercial deals, and Facebook ultimately had obviously backed down on its action to remove news from Australia. So I think they were feeling pretty good. And then I think when you look on the Facebook side, they probably have a few things to feel good about as well. They got a few concessions at the last minute, so it could have been a lot worse. I think they would have wound up in a pretty bad place if they had been forced to continue keeping news out of Australia.
At the time, Stephen, I saw that Canada was one country thinking of following suit, and others perhaps as well. Do you think this victory for Australia has in fact set a precedent?
I sense that it is a precedent setter, right? I mean, this is one of the first countries in the world, if not the first, that's kind of gotten the big tech players to this point around this particular issue, around paying for newsworthy content. So, it's the first golfer in the clubhouse, or the first cab off the rank, whatever your metaphor. And it will certainly, it'll draw a lot of scrutiny. It'll draw a lot of comparisons. And, if other governments want to see what the big tech will agree to, well, this is it. This is one thing they will agree to. Maybe they want other countries want to go further, but at least we've seen here, this is how far Australia could get.
I mean, it's also provoked the argument that big tech should be more controlled. There should be more regulation, especially on the big five. Should they be more controlled, do you think, and regulated, or would that stifle innovation and dampen enthusiasm?
Yeah, there's certainly arguments on both sides. I think the dead hand of regulation can impinge on creativity and innovation, and it does have that effect. But on the other hand, monopolies also tend to impinge innovation, as far as my economic understanding goes. So there's can be negatives on both sides. Tech is so big, and the negative externalities of the internet and social media are now getting so big, and net we live in a better world because of the internet and because of social media. I think the world is better, but the negative externalities around data privacy, around mental health issues, around democracy and how information flows, all those things are now big enough that we really do have to tackle them. I think we've seen that leaving it to self-regulation of the industry itself is probably not the right solution in and of itself. So I think we do, in some, need more regulation across the board for big tech in different countries.
Is there any one particular aspect of big tech that does need regulation, that won't stifle innovation? Antitrust, for example?
In my view, I think there's a couple areas that we need to get a better grip on. One is data privacy. We don't understand the value of our data. We don't have any control over our data. And I think that's a problem. I think we've got to start to impose some rules around that so that we have control. Just say we have property rights in most countries in the world. Almost every country in the world, you recognize individual property rights. Well, we need now to recognize data as a property, and that individuals need to take control. I think that's one area. I think another is the impact on the flow of information, and particularly free societies where democracy is really founded on another pillar, a very important pillar, which is a free press and investigative journalism. And unfortunately, the effect of where we are with technology today, the internet and social media in particular, is we are hollowing out that institution of the free press. And so we need to redress that. And this legislation here in Australia has been an effort to redress that. It's not perfect, but I think it's a good step in the right direction. But we need to do more of that around the world, or we are going to wind up as we have very quickly in a bad situation of filter bubbles and half truths, and people not agreeing even on the common facts that we have in a democracy when we go to the polls.
So that would seem to imply it does need a bigger watchdog, more regulation, in other words. But every country's attitude towards regulation and control is different, isn't it? Especially America's and Australia's approach.
There's differences in coloration, different degrees, but that's one of the problems that we do face today with industries and companies, the scale of big technology, right? We've always had multinationals and big companies for 100+ years, but now these big companies really have more power and more data and more influence on on how even opinions are formed in different countries, and that's pretty unprecedented. And yet, that's not how regulation works. Regulation works on a country by country basis generally, and that's so in a way that's kind of advantage big tech in that case, because they can fight fires on lots of different fronts, and they can play off different jurisdictions against each other. They can run out the clock on certain politicians and political regimes and wait for them to turn over. What Facebook, Google are going to be around probably in decades from now. Most governments won't be here even a few years from now in many cases. So, you probably could say that the world isn't well set up to deal with the challenge of regulating big tech.
Stephen Shealer, former CEO of Facebook in Australia and New Zealand, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
My pleasure.